It's great to be in Florence presenting the most recent developments in our strategy for measuring child wellbeing in the guide surveys. And thank you so much to Gabriele, and please do send us that list of things that you would like to measure, because we'd be very, very interested in that. So the work I'm going to present here is the work that we've been doing in the Coordinate project, but also in our Guide Prep project, and also more broadly as a consortium of partners working on the guide. As you know already, Guide is a large international consortium of over 20 different countries in Europe and associated countries. And together, members of this consortium have been working over the last decade to conceptualize how we measure child well-being in a cross-national study of children and adolescents and young adults. So I want to start my talk with a provocative question of how do we measure well-being? And in a lot of the material that you'll read or the discussions that you'll have with people talk about well-being as if it's somehow something that's obvious and easy to understand, as if it refers to something in particular. And I think that there are so many different views on well-being that the starting place for any study on children's well-being must be this question of what is well-being. And what was really interesting earlier today was when we heard from the children and young people that Gary showed us in those videos, and when they were asked to speak about happiness and happiness being a type of well-being and their reasons for why they were happy. It's quite different from looking at something like a child's internalizing or externalizing behaviors and problems as conceptualizing well-being. So really, who is right? Is there one answer to what well-being is? So some of the issues with well-being definitions is that there's a lot of conceptual haziness. And with the classical definition of well-being, you can overlap a lot of the different measurement dimensions. And also when people talk about it, they say things like, oh, I feel good because I'm contributing and that makes me happy. And you think, well, where can we really break these things apart? Should they be broken apart? There are these under definitions of well-being that are sometimes found in the scientific literature, where people use a very, very narrow indicator to represent well-being, for example, hope in the future. Sometimes well-being may even indeed be slightly over-defined. So is it everything? Does it capture everything about human experience? Are we just walking manifestations of well-being and ill-being? And there's jingle and jangle, where two constructs are used to refer to each other or to something that's different in a way that's very confusing and inaccurate scientifically. So still talking about some of the ways that we measure well-being or that we can conceptualize it, one approach is to look at well-being from this very micro level of psychological functioning, and looking at this from the perspective of the positive psychology frames of thinking through well-being, which would be taking these very discrete indicators of what's happening in people's minds, like optimism, having experiences of joy, maybe love, experiencing life satisfaction, being motivated. So that would be a very micro level perspective on individual well-being. And of course, you'll all be familiar with this macro level perspective on well-being, where there's been a really important and useful surge of countries developing national frameworks to measure well-being in children and adults. Here on the screen, I'm displaying Ireland's well-being framework that was recently developed over the last 2 to 3 years in collaboration with many different partners in the Irish community and policy sector. And this is building off other international frameworks of well-being, such as the one that's been recently developed in New Zealand. But what about classical perspectives on well-being. So the philosophy of well-being. And here you'll all be familiar with the idea of Aristotelian well-being, and I'm illustrating it here with a quote that I found on a bench when I was taking a family holiday last year in the west coast of Ireland. And the quote reads, "Success is manufactured in the mind, while happiness is cultivated in the soul." And I thought this was a very, very nice description of the classical eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, where eudaimonic well-being is your sense of meaning and purpose in life. What do you contribute? What's your role in society? While hedonic well-being is the positive emotions that you feel as you make your way through life. Now, I think it's time for us to put our science hats on, because I'm just going to introduce something briefly. And if you don't want to think about this very deeply, you don't have to, okay? But as a developmental psychologist, this is a kind of thing that keeps me up late at night and keeps my brain active, and I love it. So I just want to say that in developmental theory, there is this idea of dynamical systems, which is used in many, many other scientific disciplines. And one of the hallmarks of dynamical systems, which is something to consider when we're measuring something like well-being, is that a dynamical system is made up of different parts. Like here, you can see the different oranges. So let's imagine well-being as a system that's made up of different components or parts. One of the problems with this from measurement theory is that when you put the parts together, they form a whole, but the whole is somehow unique in its own right. It is more than just the sum of its parts. So here I have this really nice illustration from a concept that Richard Lerner, who's a developmental psychologist from the US, wrote in one of his really early works in the 1980s that I found and pulled out, that you can't just put all of the oranges, these parts together, and then have a whole, because actually it transforms into something that's qualitatively unique, like a motorbike. So how can a bunch of oranges become a motorbike? Now, if you're not interested in that, you can forget about it. But for those of you in the audience and who are listening who are interested and intrigued about how well-being can be measured like dynamical systems, you can just remember the oranges and the motorbikes for later, okay? So now I want to talk briefly through measuring child well-being in the GUIDE survey and what we have done so far. And here you can see an absolutely incredible list of activities that have been done, not just by myself. In fact, I only came into the GUIDE study relatively recently in 2019, but by my colleagues who have developed the GUIDE over the last 10 years. And here you can see from the foundations of starting to think about measuring child well-being, there was a lot of participatory involvement. We did a stakeholder Delphi. We did expert interviews with academics, NGOs, policymakers. We've also had youth advisory boards operating throughout the study. We've done horizon scanning. We've done a systematic review of well-being measurements. And in the earlier projects that were supporting the development of GUIDE, we developed a prototype questionnaire. We've done work on conceptual perspectives and questionnaire design very recently, and I'm going to present that to you today. And then after my presentation, Tony Babarovic will talk you through the questionnaire piloting. And what we're going to do next, after we finish this piloting, is we're going to do more in-depth investigations into the measurements of well-being. And then that's going to be published as part of our open access book that will be coming out in the next 2 years. And then following that, then we're going to go and do the proper first wave of data collection in 2026. So as you can see, it's a very long process of measuring well-being that's being done in a very participatory manner with some of these partners in different countries. And you can see here that we really do have a international set of experts who are working on developing our perspective on measuring well-being. It's not just coming from one country or from one culture. And the experts listed here are from all different disciplines. So we have people from policy research, sociology, economics, psychology, and a little bit of anthropology as well, and from survey methodology research. So we really are approaching this in a way that I don't think many other consortium internationally have approached this problem of measuring and defining well-being. So how can we start? One of the starting places of any cohort study is in creating a conceptual perspective around what you're doing, around how your study approaches measuring well-being in a child population in a way that's going to be sustainable over the life course of the survey, so that you're going to be able to identify causes and outcomes in relation to this key concept of well-being. And from a review that we did for the Department of Children in Ireland last year, we reviewed other cohort studies' conceptual perspectives, and you can see that there's a range of conceptual perspectives that birth cohort studies adopt in their design. And one of the things that brings these together is that really the cohort study conceptual perspectives are trying to identify inputs and outputs, what you might call outcome dimensions and impact dimensions, and they're trying to work through a theory of change. How is it that well-being changes in the life course? How is it that well-being influences outcomes in the life course? So these theories of change are not as explicit as you might imagine. In fact, there's no really, really well-defined theory of change that can be translated into a statistical model in these birth cohort studies, because the theories of change are very broad. So in the guide, we've had a lot of discussion about children's well-being and how to measure it. And part of our conceptual perspective is that we are drawing on many of these different types of theories of change that have been used by the other birth cohort studies. And because we have such an interdisciplinary perspective, really, we do need to consider many of these, such as biopsychosocial development, life course theory, risk and protective factors, early life exposure. So bringing all of those perspectives together. And of course, when you're thinking about the impact of the environment on children's well-being, we have to consider all of these different dimensions. So family, home, schools, etc. And when you're thinking about the person, what are the different aspects of lived experience that are feeding into well-being? And what does well-being look like within the person? So is it psychological well-being, hedonia, eudaimonia? Is it biopsychosocial functioning? Is it genetics? Is it physical development? What is it? And one of the things which I'm particularly interested in is dynamical systems. And now you're going to have a flashback to the oranges and the motorbike. And how can we work that into these conceptual perspectives around measuring well-being? One of the really great things that a dynamical systems perspective can contribute in thinking about life course theory is about the role of the environment in shaping the individual life trajectory. And no, it's not easily measurable. And yes, it is theoretical, but things that can become measurable need to have a good theoretical foundation that in itself can't always be directly translated into statistical measurements, because these are what we call broad meta theories about the way that humans develop. So here we can see Waddington's epigenetic landscape of development, where the balls are rolling into channels. And if you think about a structure in society, like an educational qualifications framework, as providing the walls of these this landscape, and then the individual channels that the ball rolls into can be broader, for example, in a comprehensive educational system where young people can move from one track to another fairly easily, or much narrower, like in a tracked educational system where the young person is early in a certain kind of track, educational or vocational, and the way that this shapes life outcomes. So in the guide, taking us back now to what we are actually measuring in the survey, so from the deep theoretical perspective of how human development works through into a domain-focused specific perspective of what we can measure, this is what our team of international, interdisciplinary scientific experts came up with. So here in the middle, we have well-being as defined as hedonia and eudaimonia. So from the philosophical aspect of well-being. Then around that, you can see the functioning. So physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral. And I should also put biological in there, functioning. So that would be like the internalizing, externalizing mental health, or physical well-being. How fit are you? How daily active are you? Then we have this yellow ring here, which is coming from sociology, which is not really well represented in many measurements of well-being, which is a person's experience of their lived environment. So how included are you? Do you feel that your voice is recognized? Do you have a perception of feeling that there's equality in your social environment? What's safety for you? Do you understand your rights, and can you enact them? So this is not often looked at from a well-being perspective, but it is the intersection between the person and the environment and their experience of the environment. And then the wider ring here is about the context. So these proximal developmental contexts. And this slide just shows you the same model, but in a more grid shape, so that we can see here that the things that we're measuring are in black, the things that we would like to measure are in red, but that we're not currently measuring in our pilot questionnaires. And it may be that we can get at some of the things in red through linking data, through aggregate data that's measured at a population or a local level. And it may be that we can integrate some biological measurements. We're doing an investigation of that right now. And of course, those would allow us to look at genetic data. So we've developed a suite of pilot questionnaires. And our questionnaires have been developed for 8-year-olds, the parents of 8-year-olds, and the parents of infants. And Tony will give you much greater detail about the piloting of those questionnaires following my talk. But here I want to show you the information that we're measuring to capture this really comprehensive, multiple dimensional framework of well-being. So in our child questionnaire, we're measuring hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. We're also measuring that outer ring, so the social, the physical, the cognitive functioning. We're also measuring outside of that ring the developmental context, so what's happening in schools, in families, their experience of friendships and bullying. And we've got, of course, because of our name, but also because of the importance of this in current society, very detailed measurements about digital experience, which is something, again, that we're working on, because in 5 years' time, when everything is going to start kicking off with our pilot studies, the digital context is going to be probably bigger, because it's been increasing in size since the 1970s, and it's becoming a much more pervasive context that's very difficult to distinguish from everybody's everyday communication and behavior. Then in the parent questionnaire, we are measuring things that would be very important influences on children's well-being, but also having this bi-directional relationship, and also the things that are going to create those structures that you saw in the model, where you've got the valleys and the balls rolling into these little valleys. So the background of the parent, their relationship status, their physical health, their drug and alcohol use, information as well about the child's experiences from the parent's perception. So we've got parents reporting on their children's behavior. And then for the parents of 8-year-olds, here, the parents reporting on what the children is experiencing in the parents' view, and then also some of the parenting practices. And from the parents of infants, and those of you who are interested in the economics of early childhood and infancy, hopefully we will have captured some things of interest to you here, but please let us know if we need more. So the baby's development, the baby's habits, childcare, and things like the relationships of the parents with the children, and also things about a lot of information about how the parent and child are interacting, and the parent's perception of work-life balance. So have we got it? Did we do a good job? Are we actually measuring child well-being in a way that's comprehensive and useful? So one of the things that's important to bring you back around to now is this idea of the oranges and the motorbikes. So at these different conceptual levels, if you want to study child well-being as hedonia and eudaimonia, we have those measurements for you. But if you want to take a broader perspective where you're looking at psychological, behavioral, physical functioning, that's another level of motorbike that's being created by a new set of unit of oranges. And so we have that for you as well. What about if you want to measure well-being at this macro level of policy framework? Well, yes, we have that for you as well, because we have all of these different dimensions of lived experience in the different developmental contexts. And what if you wanted to take a sociological perspective on well-being as being the structures that are deeply embedded in society that could cause deep-rooted inequalities from a social perspective? Yes, we have those as well. So what do we have to do next? One of the things that I'm really interested in our group doing is mapping these different dimensions across the child and the parent surveys and looking at that from a longitudinal design perspective. So in conclusion, bringing us back around to the question I asked at the start of the talk, what is well-being and who is right? My response to you and to my own question is that there's no right perspective. And actually, it's about the units of analysis that we take that are so well described in our different academic fields, in our different disciplines, in the different priorities of policymakers, practitioners, researchers, young people, and their families. So different units of analysis can be used to zoom out and in. And well-being as a concept is always out of reach to some extent, because there's no perfect holistic way to look at it, but we can keep trying. Thanks very much.